Asterisk the message came through the void like a knife through silence, cold, sharp, and unmistakably hostile. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't diplomacy. It was a declaration. A transmission, broadcast in every known galactic language, boomed across military channels, civilian networks, even deep space probes drifting aimlessly near forgotten stars. The message was clear. Asterisk the Galactic Empire hereby declares war on the species known as humanity. Asterisk, the voice was alien metallic, ancient and distant but unmistakably proud, threaded with the arrogance of a civilization that had never truly been challenged. They called themselves the Eldari Dominion, rulers of half the known galaxy. Millennia old, backed by fleets of warships, the size of moons, and wielders of technology bordering on the mystic, the Eldari weren't used to being ignored, let alone defied. So when humanity refused to bow, refused to sign treaties that would strip Earth of sovereignty, culture, and soul, the response was swift and unsurprising, but what no one expected. What the Empire certainly didn't expect was how humanity reacted. The scene unfolded deep within humanity's outer defense perimeter, inside the war room of the unified human command. It was midnight ship time. A dozen generals sat around a circular table lit from below by a pale blue tactical projection. All were representatives of various Terran colonies, military branches, and Earth's defense coalition. Most had scars, physical and otherwise, from past planetary wars, pirate uprisings, or border skirmishes. Veterans, every one of them. And when the Imperial message finished playing for the 5th time, something strange happened. They started laughing, not nervously, not with fear, not even with disbelief. They laughed with the shared breath of people who had seen such things before and come out the other side. Stronger, one of them nearly choked on his coffee, wiping tears from the corners of his eyes. Another leaned back, smirking as though the galaxy's most powerful empire had just told a joke. A transmission officer stood at the corner of the room, utterly confused. The rest of the bridge staff stared at the generals, unsure whether something had gone terribly wrong or spectacularly right. You hear that? One of the generals chuckled between breaths. They actually think this is going to go their way. They have no idea, another added, voice calm but laced with ice. They've fought civilizations. They've conquered species. But they've never fought us. Not really. The officer finally spoke. Sir, I don't understand. Shouldn't we be preparing countermeasures? Evacuations? The Imperial fleets are already mobilizing in Sector 6. There was a brief silence, then soft chuckles resumed. Relax. Lieutenant, an older general said, his voice scarred by decades of command. Let them come. Let them bring their dreadnoughts, their tech, their arrogance. They're not prepared for what humanity really is. Because what the Eldari and the rest of the galaxy had never understood, what they'd never bothered to understand, was that humanity didn't survive by being the strongest. They survived by being the most dangerous. To the Empire, war was ceremonial, predictable, bound by honor codes and fleet formations centuries old. They fought with elegance, with precision, with pride. Humans fought like devils with nothing to lose. Back on Earth, the news spread fast. Panic began to rise in the cities. People flooded underground shelters. Families stocked up on supplies. Old military vets dusted off service medals and stared at their walls a little too long. But once the military response began, fear gave way to something else. Something ancient. Something buried deep in humanity's bones. Resolve. Across Luna's shadowy bases. Orbital shipyards lit up like bonfires as warships were pulled from dry dock ahead of schedule. AI battle networks' legal gray zones left dormant for ethical reasons were reactivated without a second thought. Infantry schools went into overdrive. Recruits poured in by the thousands, faces hard and expressions harder. They didn't need to be told what was coming. They could feel it. In some of the distant colonies, the mood was less anxious, more grimly amused. On Titan, one soldier carved the Imperial message into the wall of the barracks just so new trainees could read it every morning and laugh. On Mars, a tactical team replaced their unit patch with a new logo, a grinning skull in front of a burning crown. No one knew when the first shot would be fired, but everyone knew where it would start. The rim frontier, humanity's most exposed region, was littered with mining stations, small trade posts, and a few early warning satellites. The Empire's scouts had already made appearance near the edges, probing responses, trying to measure humanity's strength. What they found looked like weakness. Scattered garrisons, light patrols, a few outposts barely armed for basic defense, but what the Empire consistently missed was that humanity had learned to fight under worse conditions. And they didn't wait for the storm to come, they ran towards it. The generals weren't laughing out of bravado. They knew war would be brutal. Blood would be spilled. Cities might burn. Humanity would suffer, the civilians always did. But that wasn't the whole story. Not even close, because buried in every human's DNA is a history the stars never saw. A history of wars on muddy fields, in frozen trenches, in burning cities and orbital firestorms. Humanity hadn't been bred for elegance. They were born out of chaos, forged in fire, trained by centuries of fighting enemies both within and beyond. Empires rise, empires fall. But humanity? Humanity endures. In a small room aboard an aging cruiser patrolling near Proxima's edge, a young pilot watched the latest analysis screen flicker with incoming fleet trajectories. Hundreds of Imperial ships, each one a marvel of silver architecture and ancient engineering. He stared for a while, then glanced at his fellow officers. Nobody spoke. Then, quietly, he said, "They really think they've already won." The communications officer snorted. That's the funny part. Back in the war room, as the tactical lights pulsed slowly like a heartbeat, the lead general stood. His shadow stretched long across the polished floor, and everyone fell quiet as he leaned forward, hands on the table, voice grave but steady. "They want a war," he said. "Fine, we'll give it to them. But this won't be the kind of war they know. This won't be fleets meeting politely in formation. This is going to be ugly. It's going to be brutal. It's going to be human." He looked around the table into the eyes of every officer. "We won't fight to defend Earth. We'll fight to remind the galaxy why it should never have forgotten who we are. Let them fear the stars again." Then, as the room dimmed and the first alert klaxons started to wail through the fleet, the countdown to engagement lit up over every screen, ticking down toward the inevitable 10 hours until contact. 10 hours until humanity's answer, and far across the void, within the golden chambers of the Imperial Council, the Eldari celebrated what they believed would be a swift and glorious conquest. They had prepared for every contingency. Except for the one where the prey turned around, and smiled. As the dark slipped closer and the stars held their breath. One truth hung unspoken across both sides of the galaxy: the Galactic Empire had just declared war on the wrong species. The first real glimpse of the enemy came not through a telescope, but through the quiet static of a long-range listening station on the edge of the Zeta Corridor. A technician, sitting half asleep during the graveyard shift, stared at the anomaly blinking on his screen. At first, he thought it was just noise, another solar flare, maybe a rogue asteroid throwing off the sensors. But as the shape refined itself, as the signal sharpened, he realized what it was: ships, hundreds of them. Big ones, moving in formation, cloaked in particle clouds to mask their emissions. It was the spear tip. The technician didn't speak. Just reached across his console, hit the priority code, and watched the warning feeds burst to life across every human military channel. By the time command confirmed it, the fleet had already split into 3 distinct vectors, one heading toward the mining colonies of the Thalos Reach, another pressing toward the Proxima Gate, and the largest aiming straight at the Mars sector. The attack wouldn't be surgical. It would be overwhelming, fast, clean in their minds. Smash the outposts, disrupt communications, eliminate resistance before it had a chance to rally. That was the Imperial way's with domination, followed by subjugation, with an offer for the surviving populations to kneel or be erased, but they still didn't understand who they were dealing with. Humanity had never fought clean wars. Their history was filled with grinding, bitter battles where nothing made sense and chaos ruled the field. Their genius wasn't in matching strength, although they could. It was in adaptation, improvisation, turning scraps into weapons, turning defeat into bait, turning desperation into fury. 5 hours after the first warning, emergency task forces were reactivated from cold storage. Old cruisers that hadn't flown in 10 years were pulled directly from orbital museums, retrofitted with newer drives and plasma turrets bolted on in back rooms by engineers who worked while humming war songs from a previous century, but it wasn't. Just the newer soldiers rising to the call on Ceres Station. An old captain stepped back inside a command chair he once swore he'd never sit in again. On Earth, retired strategists who had grown gray drawing contingency plans finally watched one tick into motion. In scattered bunkers across the belt, war veterans plugged into neural combat link-ups again, ignoring the old scarring down their necks. Deep down, none of them wanted war, but denying it wouldn't change it. And if they had a chance to fight, to protect what was left of Earth's fragile, fire-forged unity, they would, across the stars. Colonies stopped arguing with Central Command and started sending resources. Luzon orbital gifted stealth drones scavenged from pirate hunters. Europa-class freighters were refitted as missile frigates in underground shipyards. Even rogue AI collectives, long exiled from Terran space for unpredictable behavior, quietly offered black box algorithms wrapped in encryption old debts owed. Being cashed in, and still, the Imperial fleet came. They entered human space with the precision of a machine empire, their lead ships dripping with gold and silver plating, the kind of ornamentation only a completely overconfident conqueror would carry into war. Each vessel was sleek, monumental, adorned with glowing runes and quantum shields that thrummed with invisible energy. Their communications were short, formal. Broadcasts labeled humanity as the primitive upstarts and spoke of the swift restoration of galactic order. They hadn't seen Earth in centuries, had never bothered to visit the outer colonies. They'd only read briefings, numbers, weapon strength estimates, population densities, psychological profiles that declared humanity emotionally unstable, unpredictable, and unfit for self-governance, but what the profiles represented as a weakness. Those who knew humans better saw as a very specific kind of strength. Out on Proxima's edge, a scout team of 3 Terran ships intercepted the first wave. According to protocol, they were supposed to retreat, report intel, and regroup. But instead, they attacked immediately. A direct strike on the lead destroyer. Small, suicidal, unexpected. They went dark the moment they fired, a blind launch of imp-adapted projectiles. Not fancy tech, but handcrafted in back-alley maintenance bays from magnetic waste and volatile fuel cells. One hit landed. Just one dot. It didn't destroy the destroyer, but it scrambled its targeting, long enough for the rest of the Empire's formation to shift and balk, breaking tempo. That tiny window, just seconds long, was precisely calculated into the greater plan. Humanity didn't need to win every battle. It just needed the galaxy to see it wouldn't roll over. That it would bite back at Central Command. The generals watched the battle maps light up. Red across the upper sectors. Orange floods down through the colony routes. Civilian evacuation patterns overlapped emergency military zones. The entire screen looked like it was bleeding, but none of them flinched, because these weren't men and women sitting behind desks. These were commanders who had watched cities fall only to rebuild them, watched comrades die only to weaponize that grief. And now, with the shadow of the oldest galactic empire sweeping toward Earth, they felt no fear, only purpose. One of the tactical analysts, young, still fresh-faced, looked around the room nervously and asked, "What's the plan when they reach Sol?" A general, his rank stripes faded under a layer of dust, didn't look away from the timer. "We don't wait for them to reach Sol," he said, and then he showed them the map. Not a defensive plan, not a retreat path, but a counterstrike protocol that bypassed Imperial trajectories and cut through deep space anomalies only navigable with old Earth tech the Empire had never seen. A backdoor path through uncharted gravity wells, shielded asteroid belts, and abandoned ancient gates long forgotten by the stars. They would take the fight to them. Meanwhile, deep in the Imperial fleet, among sleek halls of glowing crystal and polished alloy, not everyone shared the same certainty. A younger noble commander, overseeing a squadron of escort gunships, watched several early reports trickle in. Losses not heavy, but unexpected. Probes vanishing along the human belt, entire outposts gone dark without a single distress call. Pirate clans supposedly hired to probe local defenses now refusing to breach. Human space altogether, he said nothing at the War Council. But in private, he walked the darkened corridors of his vessel and stared out into the streaking expanse of Terran-controlled space. So silent, so empty. It reminded him of the old stories. The ones his tutors skipped over. Whispers of battles not written in official archives. Glimpses of human inventions that terrified even hardened warlords. Weapons built not to kill soldiers, but to make rulers disappear. Acts of war scorched from galactic memory not because humans lost, but because someone wanted their victories buried. He tried bringing it up with his superior. "Your concern is noted," came the cool reply. "But we are not fighting monsters. We are correcting chaos. This species is unseasoned. Then why are they laughing at us?" he asked quietly. The superior didn't answer. Far from the fleet, buried beneath the surface of a remote moon in the Argon system, a human sleeper unit prepared for activation. These were not frontline soldiers. These were ghosts. Men and women trained to insert into occupied zones without support. Operatives who had been waiting in place for years, even decades. Now, their moment had come. A single word pinged across private secure channels. Awaken. The war wasn't about territory anymore. Not for humanity? It wasn't even about survival. It was about sending a message. That message wouldn't come through diplomatic envoys or intercepted broadcasts. It would come in the form of a shattered dreadnought still smoldering, dropped into orbit over a neutral system. It would come through anonymous data packages exposing Imperial atrocities recorded by hidden drones, weeks before the first shots were fired. It would come through silence, a long, weaponized silence from sectors the Empire believed they already controlled, until they realized no one was responding because no one was left, back on Earth. High above the clouds, a command station watched the timelines converge. Shuttles loaded with evacuees. Battle fleets forming from what once were trade convoys. Engineers hauling containers marked "Do Not Open" from deep vault storage, the kind of tech forbidden by treaty. Even Earth's own laws. This wasn't just a war between empires. This was a challenge thrown at the feet of a civilization that had spent centuries being told it was too chaotic for peace, too stubborn for diplomacy, too dangerous for freedom. The galaxy's mistake wasn't declaring war. It was underestimating what humanity had become in the shadows of peace. And far beyond any fleet's reach. Just past the outer marker where light gives way to dark, something else stirred. Not a ship, not a weapon. Something older. Something lost on the deepest classified levels of human command. Where only a few dared to go, the final protocol was being reviewed. One that hadn't been touched since the earliest Terran expansion. One that had no label, no name, just a locked file with a blinking status light that had suddenly turned green. And somewhere inside that darkness, where the Empire had looked and found nothing of interest, where history swore only silence existed, humanity had left a secret, and now it was waking up. Just outside the shadow of HFY 7, a dead moon orbiting a collapsing gas giant, a human recon patrol drifted in full silence mode. The ship, patched together from older Terran Navy scraps and covered in ceramic shielding more suited for stealth than style, hung in the dark with its engines cold, watching. They weren't here to fight. Not yet, anyway. Their job was to observe and then vanish, but nobody aboard was breathing comfortably, because from the windowless bow of the recon cruiser, they could clearly see the Imperial fleet's forward staging line. Dozens of battleships in perfect formation, their polished hulls gleaming with quiet menace. They rotated slowly around a binary energy station that had once been a mining colony, now stripped, gutted, and converted into a war platform bristling with long-range pulse cannons. The officer in charge didn't speak. She just stared at the readings, arms crossed, jaw set hard. Then, finally, she leaned forward and tapped the display, highlighting 5 ships, though those weren't warships, they were carriers. And they were full. The most powerful Empire strike groups didn't need numbers. They carried small, elite units bred for conquest, genetically honed warriors augmented with implants calibrated for absolute efficiency. The Empire didn't deploy them unless it wanted to erase resistance. Completely. So the analysis confirmed what they all feared. This wasn't a show of force. It was the opening phase of extermination. Back in the Sol system, the mood was different. Not panicked anymore. Just still. A kind of tight, controlled stillness. Humanity wasn't terrified. They were preparing, one whisper at a time. On the lower decks of an assembly platform above Saturn's rings, a group of technicians worked through the night outfitting an old long-range destroyer. The ship had been a memorial once, turned into a floating museum. Now it was being stripped and rebuilt for frontline deployment. In one corner, a grizzled engineer was wiring something by hand, muttering low under his breath. He noticed the younger tech watching him inconsistently from across the table. "You ever heard of the salient protocol?" he asked quietly, not looking up. The younger one hesitated, then shook his head. "No, should I have?" The old man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Nobody should have. "That's the point." He slid the small component he was holding into the side of the panel. It hissed softly, locking into place. For just a moment, the lights in the chamber flickered. "The Empire thinks we're fighting with all we've got," the old man added, getting to his feet and wiping grease from his hands. "They have no idea we're still only unpacking the closet." Elsewhere, different threads to the same war began forming. In the deep backwater colony of Ivan's Hold, where farms spanned continents and satellites hadn't been updated in decades. The first drop ships touched down. They weren't Imperial warcraft, at least not visibly. No markings, just black, silent vessels. They came down just before dawn, not with a roar, but a whisper. The sky didn't even react, and with a level of precision unnerving even for the locals. Communications blinked out across the entire northern sector. A week later, an emergency signal burst into orbit from a private comms relay hidden in the hills. 15 seconds of footage, grainy, unstable, but enough to see people fleeing. Enough to hear the fire. The signal cut before it could say more. And 10 minutes after that, half a dozen Ghost-class human vessels dropped from slipspace and vanished into orbit. Silent and angry, humanity had been waiting too long to protect what was theirs. They didn't believe in overwhelming responses. You couldn't always win like that. But surgical rage? That was something they'd mastered. Meanwhile, within the Imperial High Fleet, the Council aboard the command flagship grew restless. Reports were starting to paint an uneven picture. For every colonist surrendering peacefully, there were whole strongholds going dark without warning. Entire villages on habitable moons that seemed to disappear into the terrain, leaving only smoke. One counselor, a younger member from a newer bloodline, raised the concern. "They're not retreating," he said, adjusting the light filters across the tactical map. "They're reorganizing. They're moving faster than projected, adapting at rates our simulations didn't predict." An elder across the room scoffed. "They are desperate. That's all. Desperate things scramble." The younger one didn't respond right away. Instead, he tapped a section of the outer ring of their projected occupation route. "This was supposed to be Phase 2, he muttered. "But instead, human strike teams blew up 2 of our forward posts before we even reached them." "Their puny rebellions won't matter," came the reply, but the younger voice spoke again, softer this time. "They aren't rebelling. They're hunting." Back on Earth, in a bunker buried miles beneath the Pacific, the real war was already being played out in shadows. A group of intelligence analysts pored over decrypted fragments pulled from compromised Empire channels. Their screens displayed paths, movements, threat assessments. But one piece of information kept flashing red. The Empire had a wild card, a super weapon. Maybe not confirmed, but referenced. Something ancient, even by their own standards. The name came up only once, buried in a ghost file within their black site communications. Project Seraphim. What it was, no one knew. But the fact they were moving toward Sol clearly meant they intended to deploy it or scare humanity into surrendering using the threat of it, except the humans weren't planning to surrender. And now, for the first time in centuries, humanity was dusting off one last failsafe deep in the layers of Earth's low-orbit defense cloud, concealed by decoy signals and orbital debris fields. An old station powered back to life. No greeting, no signal, just a coded acknowledgement of activation and its AI. Long black boxed under 100 levels of failsafes. Completed its boot sequence with one line of ancient Terran naval code. *** contingency authorized. Apex protocol green. ***. Nobody talked about Apex anymore. Even during training simulations, it was classified higher than anything else, the sort of protocol you only ever heard of in rumors passed between veterans over drinks they didn't finish, and now it was awake. This wasn't just a war being fought with bullets and plasma. This was legacy versus survival, empire versus memory. And while the movement of ships and placement of troops told a story of two powers clashing, the deeper game, the one played beneath the surface, was about who history would remember. Humanity had already written its history in blood and sacrifice. They weren't eager to paint another chapter, but they'd carve it in if they had to, on the far side of Mercury, hidden under miles of collapsed mining tunnels. A small group of human operatives activated an ancient Stargate ring. It hadn't been used in over 100 years, not for travel, but in the old wars it had been part of a bypass network that let Terran stealth units traverse hundreds of light years without creating a detectable signature. The Imperials didn't even know the gates were still functional. The team loaded crates onto waiting skiffs. Inside were war drones never before deployed beyond simulations. Machines programmed not with traditional AI, but with neural templates derived from actual human soldiers, scanned on deathbeds, captured memory, instincts, trauma. Weapons that didn't think like silicon. They thought like us. In nearly every Imperial war waged across the stars, resistance had come in waves, predictable, emotional, straightforward, but now the stories were mutating. Importer trade ships turning up empty, burned from within, Imperial crews found floating, but their ship systems perfectly intact, whole planetary arrays hijacked by unknown sources, flooding Imperial logistics routes with fake codes and misinformation. In every slice, every wound inflicted, there was no sign of hesitation, just precision, clarity, a message: you shouldn't have come here. And still, the heart of the storm hadn't arrived. The Empire believed it was winning because it hadn't faced the full weight of Earth's force, but what they didn't see, what they failed to calculate, was that the real army hadn't left yet. The deepest fleets, the quiet fleets, the ones built in hidden orbital shipyards near neutron stars. The ones so dangerous Earth itself had refused to bring them back until now. They hadn't been deployed, not because command was unsure, but because timing mattered. The Empire had made the mistake of thinking this was going to end quickly, and humanity, they were just now getting started. The cold edges of deep space were never truly silent, not anymore. In the distance, you could hear them, communications pings bouncing across vacuum, sensor drifts flashing warnings, fleet transponders humming their readiness across encrypted bands. The void was noisy with war now, but it was the kind of noise veterans could feel in their bones, not just hear. Tension running through unseen waves, clenched between stars like breath held tight before the first thunder breaks. And still, both sides waited. The Imperial fleet had reached Mars orbit 4 days earlier than predicted. They didn't even try to hide it anymore, not from satellites. Not from shipyards, not from the countless eyes watching from behind scorched windows and static blurred holofeeds. That was part of the strategy. A show, a staged execution. They came in with all their banners raised, gold hulls reflecting sunlight, their carriers trailing haze clouds that shimmered like silk against the black. A fleet meant to conquer, yes, but also to humiliate. But instead of scattering, the humans had done something strange. They stood their ground, from the rust-rimmed Mars domes to the synthetic torch cities of Europa. Nobody ran. Civilians still moved in cycles, shifting underground as expected, loading transports and hurrying children toward hardened shelters, but not in fear. In rhythm, as if this had always been part of the plan, because in some ways it had. They'd known this would come someday. The Empire had made too many moves, stretched too far, and humanity was the one frontier it never fully understood. It treated them like another species to outmaneuver. Something half feral, but humans weren't just fighters. They were planners too. They didn't wait for odds to tilt in their favor. They tilted them. One of the generals aboard the orbital command station paced slowly, eyes locked on the tactical displays. Fleet markers, planetary signals, energy output spikes. Everything tracked. Everything prepared? He'd slept 12 hours in the last 5 days. And there was only one thing keeping him on his feet now: momentum. "They're holding," a communications officer said quietly, watching the data come in from an outpost near Phobos. "No advance yet. Flanking units are drifting behind Jupiter but haven't moved." He didn't answer immediately, narrowing his eyes at a cluster of blinking red symbols near the outer rim of the Sol defense grid. "They're waiting for us to flinch," he muttered. The officer frowned. "Do you think we should pull the deep patrols back?" "No, that's what they want. If we begin shifting those ships, they'll catch the gaps. They'll punch through and drop troops before our inner grid reacts. Then what can we do, sir?" "Hold." He leaned forward, voice hardening. "We hold the line. And when they commit, we make sure they regret every meter they cross. Out past the orbit of Plateau. In a dark sector now called the Kill Zone by the analysts reviewing Cum's logs. A separate game was playing out, one the Empire had barely acknowledged. It was here that the forgotten fleets waited. Not the polished capital ships or the ceremonial carriers polished for galactic parade. These were the silent picks, black-hulled destroyers scrubbed from Terran registries, running zero response protocols and absorbing power from deep star radiation. Only a few humans even knew they existed, and those who did sometimes wished they didn't. Each one had been built for one purpose: strategic extinction. Not warfare, not conflict, but to serve as a line-crossing answer to Empire-level threats. Ships created when humanity stopped trying to win arguments and started building nightmares. And now, their cooldown timers had finally expired. Hidden commanders received a single coded burst. "Stand by. Apex engagement window nearing." Meanwhile, something deeper stirred beneath the Martian crust. It was only a whisper in old databanks and archival tag left untranslated. After the Exodus Wars, just a word: vault fire. No civilian ever knew what it meant. Only a few military directors carried clearance to even see the schematic files. But beneath Arcadia Mesa, under layers of rock, dust, and terraform shielding, there was a bay carved by plasma drills 600 years ago. Inside it sat a weapon never tested, powered by a volatile core held in magnetic lockdown, covered in warning signs in 6 languages, and sealed with a code that hadn't been uttered aloud in generations until now. What had once been classified as an absolute deterrent was about to become operational. And yet, the most dangerous pieces weren't weapons, they were people. Among the thick jungles growing in artificial biospheres on Eden Ixa planet, untouched by the current war, an old soldier stepped from a regenerative therapy pod, his eyes blinking against the sudden light. He'd once led a campaign that turned an entire interstellar siege in 48 hours. But he'd vanished when peace treaties were signed. Now, the codes were back online. The calls had reached him. He wasn't the only one. Across the scattered reaches of the human sphere, ghost soldiers, black badges, and off-grid tacticians began to stir. not because they were drafted, but because they chose to return, not for governments or politics, but because they'd seen how empires treated humans, how the galaxy always talked about them instead of to them. And now the line had been crossed, every warning ignored, every attempt at peace mocked. It wasn't just revenge anymore. This was about making the stars remember the Empire, for all its elegance and control, was rooted in assumption. It assumed humans would break when pressured, that chaos could never triumph over structure, that instinct and emotion were flaws, not strengths. But what frightened them, what they couldn't predict, was that humanity had learned to turn chaos into precision. Nothing showed that more clearly than what followed at the Dark Pass Relay. A minor fleet of experimental human interceptors had routed an Imperial forward scouting party in under 4 minutes. No traditional weapons, just kinetic sabotage, asymmetric drone swarms, corrupted signal loops, and old debris fields converted into gravity traps. The lead Imperial ship had imploded before it ever fired a shot, the footage released only across internal defense. Networks was dissected by human commanders over and over. The victory wasn't the shocking part. It was the style of it. Every moment was choreographed, cold, deliberate, efficient in a way that sent chills down even military spines. That attack was sterile, one analyst said under her breath. It wasn't an attack, her superior replied. It was a message. We're not fighting to wound. We're fighting to erase. Back inside Imperial command centers, the mood had shifted. Reports had gone from optimistic projections to revised estimates. Now they were seeing losses, unexplainable ones. Ships returning damaged without battle. Fleets rerouted by invisible disruptions. Entire planets closing off. Their populations vanishing underground before the cargo ramps could even extend. In private, even the most loyal voices began to ask, what if we came too late? One noble, tasked with managing the Mars operation, approached a holodisplay showing Earth blue, silent, distant. Why aren't they attacking? He whispered. And the ship's AI answered with a translated human phrase intercepted from an old, archived radio loop. Because they're aiming. Now. Days teetered into hours. In every human-controlled sector. Countdown markers flashed red at the corner of every screen. Half the population didn't know what the timer meant. The other half refused to explain, but the generals knew, the engineers, the ghost fleets. The black site techs, they all knew what happened at hour 0. It wasn't an assault. It was transformation. Earth, they believed, had been playing defense, but in truth, Earth had been coiling. Every base, every satellite, every defense drone and old relay, every underground city, all of it was part of something larger, something that now hummed with energy. Not a central weapon, a network. Ancient enemy empires thought they had seen humanity's full hand in the early wars. They hadn't seen the second one. The one, Earth saved for those who wouldn't stop, and blinking to life over every battlefield, orbit, and data feed in human space. A phrase appeared in pale red text, unannounced. Unmistakable. Phase 2. Engagement protocol live. The galaxy had declared war on humans, expecting fear, collapse, surrender. What they got was the signal that the real war had just begun. When the protocol went live, the first signs weren't explosions. They weren't even visible. They were invisible slips in the field power grids blinking out across deep occupied space. Entire Imperial battle networks crashing without attack. Their ships turned to confuse one another's locations. Friend fire systems misfiring as targeting data became scrambled. The trick wasn't in brute strength. The key had always been control, and for the first time in the entire war, the Galactic Empire was losing it. Within minutes. Ancient backdoor entries, lines of code written decades ago into acquired humanity tech reactivated. Supposedly dismantled satellites lit up across the edge of the solar system. They weren't weapons, but stabilizers. Anchors for something terrifying in its scale, a gravity net. One so large and so precise, it could break the architectural structure. of an entire fleet without ever firing a shot. It activated the moment the Empire's forward armadas crossed the threshold toward Earth. 37 ships lost helm control. 15 drifted out of formation. When the pulse finally discharged, 2 major flagships twisted apart before a shot could be fired. And still, not a single human fleet moved forward. Not yet. The plan was never to meet the Empire in open battle. The plan was to rob it of its certainty. That's when the counteroffensive began. The ghost fleets emerged from the dark. Silent picks and apex score warships folded in from the black edge of space, bypassing sensors and flanking positions that the Empire thought unbreachable. They didn't come down in fire. They came down in shadows, one by one. Key Imperial command centers across occupied sectors went silent, not just destroyed, cut out. It took the Empire 3 hours to realize what hit them, and by then, the burn had already worked through the muscle. On Phobos, as the Empire prepared for ground incursions, the humans launched a digital mimic missile, a weapon that didn't explode but instead spread through the command net like a virus. It read the Empire's communications, analyzed them, then fed copies of itself into their own transmissions. Every order from high command after that was intercepted and slightly altered. An invasion turned into a misfire. Retreat turned into an isolation. They were now losing direction. Meanwhile, humanity's colonies came alive not as victims, but as the second wave. On Europa, civilians manned repurposed mining mechs, drilling through Imperial crawler tanks from below as soldiers coordinated from repurposed stations. On Gliese 12, scientists turned weather control units into localized M cannons, blanketing drop zones with static fields that grounded any incoming aircraft, even the supposedly minor stations. The forgotten Lua Arbors or wandering Terran freighters joined the push. Every directive had the same tone: asterisk, hit, fade, return. Never be where they expect, asterisk, at the edge of Saturn's orbit, where the largest surviving segment of the Empire's fleet began to regroup. They finally encountered what humanity had truly been hiding: the Vault-Fire Array, a single ship. Old, scarred, slow. It did nothing for the first 7 minutes. Just floated into view as if mocking the slaughter still unraveling across occupied sectors. But when it activated, the stars themselves seemed to pulse. A long, steady ripple passed through the system, a kind of gravity surge, tuned and stabilized through solar halo reflectors installed 50 years ago. At first, it looked like another pulse weapon, until fleet-wide shielding configurations shut down. Across the Empire's distress scanners, the same question kept appearing: asterisk, why isn't it firing? Asterisk, it was never meant to fire. The Vault-Fire Array was a trigger. One that turned human-occupied space into a trap. It activated the machine fields hidden across celestial bodies, the ones powered by reactors long thought abandoned. Some folded entire strike teams into pocket gravity wells. Others created false star readings, drawing Imperial reinforcements into barren traps where nothing waited but engineered nothingness. No resistance. Just disappearances. Even the most elite Imperial troopers began turning off their locators. Not to hide. To keep their friends from tracking them to their ends. 4 days into the counter-assault, the reality sank in. The Galactic Empire was not going to win. And it wasn't even because they lacked firepower or courage. It was because humanity had never planned to fight fair for too long. The galaxy had seen humans as wild cards, unpredictable, chaotic, but chaos can be devastating when wielded by those who understand control. Humanity did not end the war all at once. They didn't take the Imperial throne or fly banners over foreign worlds. That wasn't the mission. Instead, they infected the narrative. Every transmission tower, every probe array left intact, every drifting listening post. Humanity hijacked them all and sent one unified message on every frequency the Empire had ever used. It said, asterisk, we asked for peace. You gave us war. We asked to be left alone. You gave us conquest. Now you know why we laugh. Asterisk, it was broadcast in every major language, including the ancient dialects of the Empire's ruling. The psychological impact alone fractured Entire fleet chains. Officers mutinied, soldiers abandoned posts, and in the command towers of the Imperial High Fleet, the last true admiral stared through his observation window toward the distant blue of Earth, not with hatred, but with something else. Confusion. They had underestimated humanity to the very end. They had thought control was power, but humans had thrived because they had always been out of control. They lived on the edge, made peace with chaos, turned disadvantage into innovation. And in this new war, they hadn't just defended themselves, they had redefined warfare. The official ceasefire came 2 weeks later. The Empire sent envoys, not warriors, to the Terran frontier. Not to demand terms, not to barter. To ask a single question. Asterisk, what are you? Asterisk, there was no official answer, but the last surviving general from Central Command, an old woman who had outlived the worst days of Earth's growing pains, sat across the table from the most feared Imperial ambassador and simply said, asterisk, we are the reason your kind forgets to sleep. Asterisk, with that, the war was over, not because treaties were signed, but because the stars had changed. The Empire slowly crumbled inward, not in fire, but in fear. It lost control not from invasion, but from the whispers of all that had been lost. The unanswered pings, the unexplained defeats, the way entire crews refused to speak of the battles they survived. Humanity, for their part, pulled back. No celebration, no conquest. They returned to their colonies, rebuilt the old stations, helped the wandering fleets come home. And when asked by newer species what they had done to win, they didn't give secrets or plans. They simply told them what they'd told each other before the war ever began. Asterisk, never give anyone a reason to forget who we are. Asterisk, in time, the galaxy moved on. New councils rose, new alliances formed, but in every strategic training academy, there was now a chapter no one skimmed over. A chapter marked only by a warning, humanity engagement protocol, only if absolutely necessary, because even now, long after the last Imperial starship drifted into silence, the message still echoed across old channels, not a threat, not a bluff, but a simple reminder, wrapped in laughter. And for those who still studied war, it was clear the Galactic Empire had declared war on humanity, but it was humanity who had finished it, one whisper at a time.